First of all, I am very honored that these three esteemed gentlemen of Game Audio have joined us today. I really appreciate you, Michael Sweet, for coming all the way out here from Boston, and Brian and Guy from Bellevue. Oh, Beacon Hill. All right. Really, really appreciate it. And this talk is really going to be about middleware and why middleware makes the difference in game audio. The introductions, you've basically already been introduced to everyone, and you know all of these guys. So these are some of the current middleware options that are available. There's quite a few. I think there's basically three that are sort of leading, sort of the rising to the top, or have been building the momentum over a long period of time. FMOD, WWISE, and Elias. What is middleware? For anyone that doesn't know here, it basically is the stuff that sits in between the sound designers and musicians and the programmers. So it makes that, I think that's the most succinct definition of middleware that I've come across. So we basically put our heads together and came up with like 15 different reasons for middleware. And the main thing that I want to get across in this talk and have everyone else sort of talk about is how do we convince the people that we're working with to use middleware? What are the things that really make the difference, and how do we explain that in a succinct way? So yeah, there's probably not enough for everybody, but if you want to pass it around. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about each one of these now, but essentially what we're going to do is have three great TED Talks, combative TED Talks, where where each person gets a chance, gets a chance to present sort of their view of middleware. It's sort of like the three sages of middleware. The blind sage is trying to describe an elephant. One feels the trunk and feels like says it's a snake. One feels the foot and it feels like a tree. The guy says, elephant is a tree, and somebody pulls the tail and says, oh man, this is stinky. Anyway, so different perspectives on middleware, and sort of in the end do a conclusion and some Q&A. I also have a bit of things that I can go over if there's some extra time. These basically are the main areas. They're sort of like the outline for what we're going to talk about. There's interactive and quality advantages for you when you use middleware. Of course, technical advantages, workflow and collaboration improvements, and also we'll talk a little bit about some of the disadvantages. So one of the top advantages is, of course, file size. You can do more with less. Guy is a master of that. Like 10 megabytes of audio, how much can you do? Variety, you can get pitch, volume, filter, and other sorts of randomization. Interactivity, polish, real-time mixing, HDR, voice limiting, and things like that. Creative freedom, not limited to one version. You can change music on the fly and change sound effects and all of that. Of course, the other technical advantages, you can prototype, so you can allow for us to build the audio before the game is ready and before the scenes are ready. Compatibility allows you to have compatibility, especially in mobile. This is really important. Scalability, not reinventing the wheel. Performance, so CPU optimization. Busing, submixing, and things like that, so that you can have one reverb instead of 30. Profiling, this is, I think, one of the key uses for middleware, especially for anybody that's releasing on iPhone or on console, making sure that you don't have too much impact on the CPU or too much variation on the CPU. And you can find out where the bugs are and where it's happening if you do. Moving on to some workflow improvements. These are things that, collaboration, the ability to work together on a project and have multiple sound designers and multiple composers working together. You have a division of labor. So the programmers focus on the programming only, and of course the audio pros get to work on the audio. This is Guy's idea. I thought it was a really good one. It's a much more elegant GUI than proprietary solutions. So other engines that people develop in-house tend to be kind of yucky to work with. Compared to some of the more elegant interfaces. Authoring and experimentation, so it allows you to do a lot of iterative experimentation, again, before the game is ready. You don't have to wait for the game to come along and say, oh man, that didn't sound good. And there's a shared community. The people in this room, I think, spearheaded a lot by Damien and his podcasts. I know I learned a lot from all of those. And of course, Brian and Game SoundCon and everything that he does. Mike's written a book, written a book on the subject. Probably one of the first ones on middleware, right?
It's more about the fundamental kind of conceptual design ideas that you might implement inside of a framework like WWISE or FMOD or Fabric or wherever. So But there are some unique books out there too, including Richard Stevens' book, which is more specific to, say, Unreal, design for sound in Unreal, which is probably more geared specifically towards a middleware platform, as well as all the documentation. Stefan Schutz did the FMOD book, and a few other people as well. So there's a lot of different people kind of working on feeding the community in terms of giving us more resources in terms of learning not only from one another, but writing these books and things like that too. So
great. So I think the game audio community is one of the sort of universally known as one of the best communities to work in games. So I think a lot of that's again thanks to Damien and Brian for bringing us all together. Some other reasons, some reasons not to use it that often come up. Of course, bugs that we can't fix because we have to wait for them to be fixed by the middleware providers. Although I've found that the top 3 middleware providers have always gotten me fixes within literally a few days. Never had to wait much more than a week to get a fix for something that I've found. Have you guys had any experiences where middleware has been a roadblock for you? Like in terms,
Well,
only from platforms that they're kind of new to, right? So if for instance, back on when WWISE first released, WWISE 1.0 or whatever, they weren't releasing to more than just a couple of platforms, and so there was a lot of beta on some of the other platforms, especially when they moved into mobile and things like that. So I think once it's gone through a couple of revisions, you don't have to worry about that. At least I haven't experienced that as much. But sometimes when there's a brand new platform that's coming out or that has just come out that they're trying to support, you'll find more bugs in something like that.
No, not really. I would say the turnaround on any software company I've worked with middleware has been pretty darn excellent. Sometimes there's an outlier like, there's more of a feature than a bug. If you're like waiting on a feature, you have to get in line and try to push your idea through, but that's a different topic altogether.
Yeah, absolutely. So the QA and approval process can sometimes be interesting. I had a client the other day said, okay, so I finally convinced them to use FMOD and use a bunch of, to give them all the examples and how to do it, basically put the project together even before they had made that decision and then played back. I made a video of the session that we created for them. They said, oh yeah, we've got to use it. They finally got it after seeing a video of it. But then they said, well, so how do we give you feedback on this? So then I had to then train them, and FMOD as far as how to, play it and hear playback and things like that. So the approval process changes as opposed to if you're just throwing assets over the fence. And costs. And they're always changing. The licensing fees are up and down, and it's kind of interesting. I do have some slides at the end that sort of go over some of those if anybody's unsure of it. So what can middleware do? I think everybody in this room probably has a pretty good idea. But one of the biggest new improvements, I think, is in VR, both WWISE and FMOD. FMOD is working with Google to put GVR in their system, so HRTFs and things like that. Of course, there's parameters. There's things like WWISE has all kinds of features. Of course, the sounds, events, triggers, states, switches, all the inheritance, the RTPCs and things like that. Of course, profilers. Here's an example of an FMOD profiler, but to me, that's one of the most beneficial things for as a sound designer is being able to tell where the sound bugs are. And also, FMOD 110 is coming out pretty soon, and you're actually able to swap sounds out. So in addition to just being able to change volumes and pitch while the game is running, you can actually swap different sounds without having to send a new build across. So those kind of things would be pretty cool that you could do that you couldn't do unless you had access to the code otherwise. There's some presets and things like that make life easier. Again, the GUI is what's so much better than using a Unity GUI or having to code it yourself. And I know Brian's going to talk about that in just a minute. Another thing that middleware is coming around to do is to help you with adaptive music. So Elias is focused just on music and allows you to do lots of different variations. It's also adding features like MIDI that allow you to basically use a set number of sound banks and a set number of memory, and then you can have infinite amount of music. Because MIDI doesn't take up any space. So here's some example projects. Actually, I have Michael's first. You want to Well, actually, because we were sorry, I think Brian has sort of got the history of game audio. So why don't we jump ahead to that one, and then we'll go to Michael second. Okay.
Okay. So I sort of set the stage. I thought we'd talk a little bit about where does middleware come from? Why does it even exist? What did people used to have to do? So not that long ago, when you wanted to put sound into a game, you would create a WAV file, you'd email it to a programmer or put it on an FTP site, or I had a bulletin board, and it was a big deal when I upgraded to ISDN because that got me up to 64 kilobits per second. And then the programmer would have to literally go into the code, add some code that looks kind of like this, recompile the game, and then listen to it. And this was a workflow, and believe it or not, actually, I did a game about a year ago where this was the workflow. So we talk about middleware, it's still not completely ubiquitous. But this obviously has a bunch of problems with it. There's much too long time between when you want to make a modification on what the game sounds like and when you actually hear it. Again, you do it instantly now. It could take days. Obviously, that's not a problem. That's a big problem. Too much reliance on a programmer. That code, I literally was in a room once where we wanted to change the way something was being done. And the programmer, this was a while ago, but he uttered the phrase, "I don't know, that's a pretty complicated piece of code." He didn't want to touch the code because as far as he was concerned, it worked, and he didn't want to try this new thing we wanted to do. And we didn't end up doing it. That also, he shortly after that did not work for that company anymore. It's an error-prone process. And sometimes even for us in our seats, the overhead of making a change, leads to, well, that's good enough. Is that really worth waiting a week to hear a new build and so on? So, but the biggest problem is that way of programming audio into a game is a drastic oversimplification of what game audio is all about. I'm preaching to the choir here. Anyone who thinks there's a one-to-one correspondence between a game event and a wave playback does not get game audio. Buzz actually credits me with that quote, but I'm positive he is the first one to say it. And he heard somebody say he heard me say it, but I stole it from him. So this is actually, of course, what a real game engine has to do. It's not a simple one-to-one process. It's a one-to-many. You've got these game engine with all these events and triggers and variables going on, and the game engine has to make sense of it based upon input from sound designers and composers and technical sound designers, and figure out what actually needs to come out of the speakers based upon wave selection, misting heuristics, DSP effects, real-time physical modeling, all this other kind of cool stuff. So I'll give an example of that. Back when the original Xbox launched, it had a really, really powerful sound chip. It was kind of Pro Tools on a chip. It had hardware HRTF. It had built-in digital filters. It had effects processing, 56,000 DSP, all this awesome stuff. And we exposed the entire functionality of the set to the programmers through what was called the Direct Sound API. We made a bunch of Xbox-specific extensions to Direct Sound. And as we were approaching, Xbox launch, we were discovering that none of these features were being used. We were paying good money for this chip from NVIDIA. And the audio, Scott Selfon and I flew literally twice around the world in the 12 months leading up to Xbox, the original Xbox launch, telling sound designers, composers, and programmers too how to use it, what it did. They're like, yeah. And it didn't get used because the programmers didn't understand what these features, they didn't know what a resonant filter was, or how to route DSP effects and things like that. So the composers wanted to use it, but the programmers had the ability to use it. And that was a fundamental mismatch. And so as a business case, we created a justification to create this GUI-based audio tool, kind of inspired by direct music, which was the idea of you had a GUI to create content and an API to play it back, and put lots of the smarts of what gets used into the content through a GUI tool. And that led to the creation of a tool we called XACT, the Xbox Audio Creation Tool, which put the knobs of this cool DSP into the hands of a sound designer through a graphical user interface. And this was kind of a predecessor. This predates WWISE by about 2 or 3 years. And then while we were doing that, we're like, hey, we could do all this other cool stuff too. I've only met Bill Gates 3 times when I was at Microsoft, and one of them was to show off this new audio tool that we were doing that was a GUI for the sound design. And actually, this is showing off real time in an Xbox development system, swapping out a sound while the game was playing. So he thought that was pretty cool. I don't remember. I was too intimidated by being next to him. But so that's where kind of the genesis of this stuff came from. Is like, how do we enable all the knowledge and creativity of sound designers in a way that doesn't require code to do stuff? And this is what the exact GUI looked like. When I saw the early release version of WWISE about 2 years later, I got horribly jealous because even though I was working on Exact, although we were kind of winding it down, I think what I told Simon was, wow, that's like Exact where we want it to be 5 years from now. It was so sophisticated, and we were just completely independently on this exact same path to how to do stuff. So that's kind of where middleware comes from. Exact and Scream were similar in time, but we were the first to do the real-time auditioning. Buzz Burroughs and I used to sort of go back and forth. I'd known him since the early 90s. And we probably told each other lots of stuff we probably shouldn't have that would have gotten us fired. Buzz Burroughs was the senior audio technologist at Sony, while I kind of had his seat at Xbox. I had a basic interactive music system that, using today's terminology, we would say did horizontal sequencing, vertical sequencing, along with stingers and transitions. So the UI was not great, but the functionality was there. And obviously, as Guy knows, the UI to drive all this stuff is so critically important. Exact was kind of the stereotypical Microsoft programmer's UI. So that's kind of the little sort of history bit on audio middleware that I had. I had a couple of little quick case studies I can just zip through super quick because I don't want to monopolize things. I had a case study about 2.5 years ago. I was contracted to do a game for a major mobile developer. And I got the audio spec, and it had in-house custom game engine for the audio there. And that was going to do 80 PCM and, had a memory footprint laid out. And it's okay, these sounds will be at 11 kilohertz because of memory restrictions and so on. And at the same time, it was all the mandate of this game was we are going to be competitive with XXX, where XXX is a game you've all heard of. And so I was trying to talk them into middleware. And what I ended up doing was a couple of things. I played a lot of XXX and figured out how much variation in audio content they had. I pointed out areas of reuse. And one thing very important was I recorded the analog audio out and stuck it through an analysis so I could see what sample rate they were doing various things at. And I could say, oh, they've got, 17 minutes of music or 25, whatever it was. And the music is all full fidelity up to around 18 kilohertz or 16 kilohertz. I think they're probably using Ogg Vorbis at 16 kilohertz or 32 kilohertz sample rate. And that isn't going to match our spec, which you had music at 22 kilohertz to fit into the memory. So that was one of the tools I used to say, we're going to be competitive with our primary purpose for existing is not congruent with we're going to write our own audio engine. So in the end, we ended up licensing a middleware solution that got us our feature set. So that's one of my case studies there. Yale's comment was that I have to build a prototype first. The devs are pretty smart, and they when I wrote up like a 4 or 5 page report, with a pretty picture of a sonogram, and that kind of got the message across. For this, it was the sample rate. I could say it's there's nothing below. It's clear that all the sound effects are 44K. It's clear the music is at least 32K, and there's no way we'll make our memory footprint. So that was one example again where middleware became a much easier sell once you put some data to it and not just say, well, I have all these neat ideas I want to do and I'm used to it, so therefore we need it kind of thing. And one of the features which falls into the latter category is, we were talking about interactive mixing before in sidechain compression. I'm in the middle right now of doing a game called Mutant Football League, where I've got crazy-ass announcer and crowd sounds and over-the-top music and explosions on the football field and big quarterbacks, big loud taunting noises, and sidechain compression and the kinds of control I could just drag and drop, tweak in real time, make that mix work where it would have been virtually impossible trying to do that without a combination GUI and middleware. Everything is doable in code. It's, once in a while I like to say, code is the ultimate middleware. Code will do exactly what you want, and it's not limited by anything. It takes a little longer. It's not quite as user-friendly as a GUI, but you can still do it. We could have coded this, but it would have taken a lot longer.
All right. I'm going to talk about a game that I've been working on for a long time. This project, the inception of this project, which just came out about 2.5 weeks ago, is a game about Henry David Thoreau. It's all about his time at Walden Pond, and it started back, the paper prototype for this was back in 2008. I didn't get involved with it until 2011, and it came out 2.5 weeks ago. Games about famous dead authors aren't being made. And so this is one of the reasons I got into teaching, actually, was because I wanted to love the projects that I worked on. And a lot of the projects that were coming in my door, I would have to do to pay rent or whatever. This is a project totally out of love, and I did get some monetary compensation out of it after a while, but it wasn't when we started. And this is something that you guys may encounter. You start with a project that doesn't have any money, right? Or that has a very small budget. And even convincing at that point, you're like, how can we use, we can't even, there are some ways to use WWISE for projects under a certain budget, right? I didn't know what was going to happen with this. I didn't know what kind of funding we'd get. So when I started, I was like, okay, well, we are starting in Unity, and actually we started, 2012, that would have been Unity 3.5, I think, which didn't have this, by the way. I wanted to talk about how much time I've wasted by not using middleware. And I think that's an important realization to kind of get into, is the amount of extra time that you'll have to do setting up things that you didn't initially think about. And one of the basic things when you're iterating a game is you don't know what the final game's going to look like. A lot of times you're iterating on it. You're, things like feature creep you've probably heard of, where the game bloats into this thing. Well, there was a lot of that on this game in terms of we didn't know what we didn't know. So I didn't know at the very beginning that I needed all these extra bells and whistles when we started. So I'm going to kind of go through a few examples of that. This is what Unity looks like now in terms of its mixing engine. And it's a lot more sophisticated than it used to be. It allows you to build as many mixers as you want. It allows you to sidechain effects like ducking and things like that directly within the engine itself. You don't need extra middleware. It's built into it. Unreal Engine and some of the other game development platforms that are out there have functionality in terms of their audio capabilities, but they may not lead you to where you want to lead. And I'm going to kind of get into why a choice at the beginning would have saved us all a lot of time. This is what the end mixer looked like, and you can see that I have a bunch of submixers here. Each one of these lines is a submixer. This is the master one, which basically has music, dialogue, sound effects, and sound effects ambience. Ambient effects would have been like birds and nature sounds and things like that. Echoes, so it takes place on Walden Pond. You can actually row your little rowboat to the middle of the pond, and it will increase the echoes in and around it, so you can actually play the flute in the middle of the pond, which is something that Henry David Thoreau used to do, and he used to play with the echoes that came back. So that's kind of the master mixing engine that we have. Now, Unity itself without too much coding, can play sounds, stop sounds, pause sounds, and route to a mixer, and that's about it. Anything else that you want to do, you have to code. Even with this, so there are some included plugins that you get. The only other thing I would say are that you have snapshots of these mixers. So, for instance, I could have one for the start where I may turn down the dialogue, or I may turn down certain things. So I have audio snapshots that I can kind of transition to over a certain amount of time. But if I want to do anything fancy, it becomes a little bit difficult. So let's go to sort of the next slide. Oh, I have a thingy here. All right. So I'm going to talk about music a little bit. So Walden started out with Henry David Thoreau thought there should be 8 seasons instead of 4. He felt like the granularity between just having 4 seasons was not enough, and that he really felt like there should be 8 seasons across, so people really paid attention to the differences. So when I went in, I was like, okay, 8 seasons, those will be our primary themes across the game. And the game designer said, I want there to be a way for the music to change based on a parameter called inspiration. So you can gain inspiration in this world by, I won't get too much into the mechanics, but we've split up each one of those 8 themes into 4 different layers that can come on and off. So I wrote all that. You can play the top one. This would be the winter music, and I'll sort of talk over this a little bit. So it has 4 different layers. We're kind of hearing just 2 layers throughout this a little bit, just to give you a flavor and sense of the music. Henry David Thoreau was a transcendentalist, which informed the music and some other things too. But in terms of thinking about it, when I first programmed it, I was like, okay, well, so everything we're going to do is going to have 4 layers. And I was like, oh, but wait, we have menus and we have specific locations. So each one of those things broke what we had, right? Which was to play a 4-layer thing. So I had to rewrite that code a bunch of times. Every time we add a new feature, I broke 6 other things. And that will be something that I kind of talk about over and over again. It's like, oh, when the menu music comes on, I need the season music to cut out, but if the location music is playing, then it does something else. And every time it becomes this like, oh my gosh, what do I do? So let's go to the next page, and I'll talk a little bit about, no, we can just in terms of time. So let's just talk about dialogue and narration. At the very beginning, there was only one idea in terms of we would have Henry David Thoreau read quotes from his book, and you would go through the game and you'd find these various arrowheads, and you pick them up. And so there's an example of that.
I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately.
I think that may just be it. But that's the famous quote at the beginning of this. And so there was no real other characters in that game. But as the game got bigger, we started adding other people like Immersion and a shopkeeper and other people. And at first that was okay because I would just interrupt, but I'd interrupt what Henry David Thoreau, or Hank, was saying to have these other things play over. But then we started thinking, well, shouldn't he be humming when he builds his house or sews things, or maybe when he gets tired, he's going to breathe, right? And he's running and he's breathing, and what interrupts what? And so every time I added one of these things, it was like, oh crap, I have to stop this other vocal because Henry is now breathing too hard because he's going to faint and all these other things. So every little change that I made, there was not an audio infrastructure in place so that it made it easy to kind of do these things. And middleware would have helped a lot with that. So every time I add a new feature, I broke 6 other things. It was just like, oh my God, how do I change this? And then lastly, I'll talk a little bit about on the next page here. I'll talk about sound effects and spatialization in the world. You can play that, I think. I happen to live 3 miles away from Walden Pond. This is a recording from my front yard. There were 3 owls in the middle of September, all talking at one another, just sort of. So this is one of the recordings that I made. Now, all the bird sounds and all the insect sounds that I had in Walden are actually recorded either at my house, which is about 3 miles away from Walden Pond, or at Walden Pond itself.
Yeah.
So they are legit.
Nobody can use libraries ever again after hearing this.
So, again, it brought into all these other kind of components that I had to worry about. Like, well, in summer, I have, in certain parts of the summer, I will have insects playing. But in June, there's no crickets playing in June but there are peeper frogs. And so I had to write this entire engine that basically had to know what time it is, what calendar part of the year. There are different night crickets than day crickets and things like that. And again, every time I did that, I had to think about, well, I have to do that all in code. Whereas if I did it with, say, WWISE, I could create states and have it all set up, and I wouldn't have to worry about the prioritization. I wouldn't have to worry about fading from one thing to another, and I would have a basic infrastructure for controlling the entire game. Now, at the beginning, we didn't know. We don't know what we don't know. So this is the challenge at the beginning of a project where you don't know how big it's going to get. Middleware still can be something that you lobby for because it's going to waste your programmers' time. If you decide not to go with middleware, it can waste your programmers, which in this case, I was the audio programmer, implementer, composer, sound designer. On this project, it wasted a lot of my time over the course of the project. And I didn't mind because it's a project more out of love than anything. I really liked working on this project. We had a great time working on it, but I would have spent way less time and made the creative much better. So it's a trade-off between if you make these choices at the beginning, your creative goes way up. So anyways, that's a little bit about, I have a FMOD project too, but let's get to probably Guy's slides and I can show those later, the FMOD project.
So did this ship just with stock Unity 5.x?
Yeah, so we went with 5.4.2 is what we shipped with. We had to, at a point, we had to stop. Every Unity, this is another thing too, every time your game development engine changes, it could change like drastically. And so it didn't affect my stuff. Unity 5 truly helped the mixing part because it added these mixers that I could lay in. But it destroyed, like every update destroyed the kind of the way the shadows rendered on. So the colorist would have to go in every time and readjust it. And they started with like, no, we're not doing any more. So that's why we sort of stopped it after a key point. And now we're doing some of the porting stuff. As a side note, all the birds are placed in trees. That was something that was really important to me, was to get the spatialization right. I hate when I listen to a game and you turn around and the sounds don't move with you. So all the birds are placed in trees. They're playing in trees. Yeah, there are follow curves on all that stuff. Although they probably can. That's part of Unity. You can control the fall-off curves in its 3D spatialization. And then I did some other things for like wind and rain and things like that to help space. Basically, I create a quad speaker array that travels along with the player that stays in the same position if you turn around. So you kind of get a spatialization that way. It's like faking it as best you can, but anyways. So exactly.
Nice.
Just real quick before I pass it off to Guy, one of the other things that this brings up is the basically the data abstraction feature, which allows the sound designers to do all of the sound and keep that separate from the code and the code maintenance, and especially on large projects that are on Perforce and so on. If we, when one thing, if they're dependent on one another in code, it's a bigger problem than if you can sort of separate those out and have data abstraction. All right, now I turn it over to Guy Whitmore.
I have an interesting question. Charles Ives influence at all?
So
as a compliment, because
and as kind of, transcendentalism is kind of interesting theory, and we can spend a lot of time talking about that too. But I also think there are also traces of modern day minimalism in and amongst that as well. So, so I was definitely drawing upon sort of the minimalist composers from the 70s up till now, but as another thing.
Really nice. Charles Ives wrote a piece called Thoreau, right? And he was always inspired by the Transcendentalists.
And was one of the first people to really explore interactive music, actually.
Totally, I'm very inspired by him. He has this thing where he was inspired by hearing two different marching bands on the field coming at different directions and hearing them kind of cross each other, playing different tonalities, different rhythms, etc., and the spatialization. Anyway, it's worth looking into if you don't know Charles Ives. So anyway, yes, I'm going to talk about my very first encounter with middleware. It was definitely a mixed bag, but the result was pretty interesting. So first contact with middleware. This is like 1996. Dan Bernstein, who was the audio director at Monolith Productions, walks into my office, takes floppy disks, a little floppy disk, 3.5, puts them on my desk, and says, "Here, see what you can do with this." That was IMA, Interactive Music Architecture, which is the precursor to Direct Music. Blue Ribbon Software got bought by Microsoft, and they were trying to figure out what to do with it. And boy, what a luxury, though, what if your boss says, "Here, take a month of your time and just play around with this." That's pretty cool. So I did. I played with it for a month and just kind of got to know the ins and outs of it. And as I was playing with it, little light bulbs started to go bling. Oh, what? Really? This is possible? Also, some of the most frustrating moments when I lost an entire day's worth of work, and it's the legend of me throwing a chair, which is true. And Dan walks into the room and gave me this eye, because I'm not known for my anger problems necessarily, but that got me. But anyway, this changed the direction of my composing, of my thinking about game audio and music, and some of the bigger things were the demo mock-up, selling an interactive idea. Throughout the process of playing with this, I recorded a piece of music that got, aesthetically they accepted. They go, "Yeah, that's a great piece for this game," in my traditional DAW, and said, "Okay, good, I got that down." Of course, authoring, and I discovered the notion of seamless transitions between different intensities with this tool. So I chopped up my music into stems and into phrases, horizontal and vertical. Before those terms were terms, just kind of diced up the music, imported it, made sample banks, because there weren't wave tracks, just made sample banks out of all these phrases. Some phrases were 2 bars, 1 bars, 4 bars, etc. And put this demo together of this track. And now it also had a pretty good demoing feature. You could kind of go, "I'm going to go from here to there and press these buttons," and it would do that for you. And that, for me, I did it for myself, but then realized, oh my God, this is how I'm going to sell it to Monolith, because it wasn't in the game yet. It was just this tool. So I sat down some of the leaders of the game and the programmers and said, "Here's what we can do." And I didn't say anything else. And I just went, boom, and pressed the next one. And they heard these transitions up and down. And I really just messed with it. And they were like, yeah, let's do that. No questions asked. That was it. In other words, my ultimate way to sell middleware is to, play it, don't say it. Just plain and simple. And I've used that technique on Peggle 2 to sell WWISE, to PopCap, and other times as well. It's just the only way. Because if you get technical and get nerdy and talk about, this will do this, and if I'm going to transition to that, the glaze will come over, and they'll still ask, why do we need that? So hearing is believing, and that was the ultimate lesson. So here's just a photo of this. Oh, I should have brought that video. I didn't even think of it. It was just one of these quick things. I might even have it, but we'll not worry about it. Anyway, what the design was a straight 3-level ambient, tension and action. So any piece of music could go from, including silence to ambience to mid-tier to action. And any one could go to any other. Now, in my talk, I was talking about the creative leads the technical. And this is a really good example where I wanted I did want that ability for any piece, any particular mode to go to any other. In other words, I wanted ambience to be able to go to action and action to silence. And so it came up with a matrix of potential transitions, and I wrote specific transitions to go from any one to any of the others. But that was something that Direct Music did not have. But because Monolith was bought into this, the programmer said, yeah, I could do that. I could create that on top of this. So they created the transition matrix tech for me and gave me a little script that I could just take these Direct Music segments, which had all kinds of variation. That was the other light bulb that went off. Direct Music, even more than what's around right now, had a really sophisticated variation system, both for matching harmony and rhythm, but also doing subtle things like having variation in, let's say something happens on beat 1. You could offset that by 2% and have a kind of a humanized feel long ago. So the idea of music not playing the same way every time and getting rid of that looping feeling really kind of hit home with this. So they built this transition system and gave me a little script that I could test out, and a little GUI outside of Direct Music to play with. And from that day forward, I was just sold on this idea that middleware can allow me to to prepare music outside of the context of the game itself. Seeing the game, and then going, here's what I'd like it to do, build, and then putting it into the game and watching it go. Now the tool, which I'll give you, here's a nice photo of that. Dun, dun, dun. And actually, this is the updated, this is Direct Music Producer, which is probably 3 years later. And they added audio tracks and other things. But it's typical piano roll, and you could build little sample banks and so forth. It's actually not that far off from what we have today. It's just, Windows, XP or something like that. Or maybe before then. It does yeah, you're right. Sorry. Whoa. Yeah. 90. Well, yeah, probably. Anyway, this was still painful to work with. I call it the Ferrari without a steering wheel. That's what authoring was like. Yep. And that was just early days. So even though it was middleware, the authoring was also, it was developed by developers, not necessarily. Music creators were involved, obviously. But that's why it's so important for the designers of the GUI to be musicians who use these tools, race car drivers, to design how it's going to handle. So you need race car drivers and mechanics to make the ultimate race car. That was the lesson there. And I think now the middleware companies are getting that. We have race car drivers designing these interfaces now, and that's actually a great thing. And I actually do think that there's a lot more evolution needs to happen on that front to connect those dots between. Because now, working in WWISE at PopCap, I learned that I want to compose while the game's running into the game in real time. I'm really close. You can get that close. But I want to be throwing it in there, playing with it, playing the game, but that's not quite right. Play. That's the ultimate thing. And whether that's a combination of your current DAW with a middleware solution or one tool, I don't care. It's just that flow from idea to game. That's kind of the holy grail, and that's kind of, I think, where we're headed. Like I said, I don't know. People say, "Oh, should it be the DAW that connects to the game and we can work there and then export it all?" I don't know. Yeah, if you can do that perfectly. I see a lot of problems with that because DAWs are linear by nature.
Isn't there a potential danger of having race car drivers have too much input, in that you would never have the Ferrari where the steering is done by the fingertips?
Yes.
Because it turns out to be a much more intuitive way, but it's not the way they did it 100 years ago.
We've already seen that. So think about sort of the mixing metaphors we're seeing in FMOD and even WWISE and other tools, where it's basically a post-production mentality, right? We're seeing linear post-production GUI in a non-linear tool. And it does not do what you expect it to do.
Oval peg in a room.
Yes.
It's not a square peg.
Yes.
But it doesn't quite fit.
It looks cool.
Right. It looks sexy as hell. Right.
This is where also one of the things that is I think where the future is going is compartmentalization, right? Although I can't say that word very well, but the idea that the composer can compose a mixer will come in and mix, and all these different things won't be reliant on a single person. In many ways, for many composers that like mixing in direct music or mixing even in WWISE today, it's still like, the composer's really involved, and it'd be nice to kind of even split out, all right, you do the mixing part. Yeah. Or technical sound designer didn't really even exist a few years ago, but that kind of the implementation phase and putting it together. And I think that will also help make these tools more useful for us over time, where, what do I specialize? I specialize in mastering music for games while the game's running or whatever it is.
It's communication, because right now we have a problem of what I would call compartmentalization, and people are in boxes. In terms, especially composers are in a box throwing out linear music, and technical sound designers are trying to dice it up and compose and rearrange it for ways that it really wasn't composed for. And composers have very little concept of how their music could be used in a game. So I think both needs to happen. Yeah, the specialties, because there's just too much work. I love kind of spanning all of that, especially on projects that you can bite off. I love mixing my own music. It's and I love making the adaptive side. But the more I do adaptive music per se, and the more intricacies that a game developer wants to have with their scores and their sounds, the more the composer has to understand that part of it, and not just be. Unless you say, okay, I want Zimmer to write me a linear set of themes, and I want, Michael Sweet to take those and blow it out into a nice orchestral, adaptive arrangement for me, and I want Brian to mix it and master it in the game,
And different companies do it different ways. Sony really definitely says, all right, you're going to compose for games like Uncharted or The Last of Us, says, all right, you compose, and then they have a team of people that like pull apart the Pro Tools sessions, get it into whatever middleware engine they're using. I think what's interesting to me is that there is no model that is like and the field's wide open for discussing new models of, well, how do we do this better in the future, and how do we make? And it's likely that Greg Edmondson would write kind of a more, maybe possibly even a more interesting score if he knew that much more about, say, interactive music in games in the way that Sony's able to sort of pull it apart and make it work really well. And I feel like you're right that new people coming into this as composers or sound designers are going to have a little bit more of a framework for how interactivity works, and it's going to make it's going to make the end products even better.
Yeah. Well, I agree it'll make it better because you have this, like you said, vertical resequencing, horizontal resequencing, stingers, transitions. But is that forcing everything into a box that's a preconception notion of what interactive music is? And is this one of the great Achilles heels of middleware? Is that by making it so easy to do stuff above a level that is linear, and it does this, that we never really get to this? Or is it just that we're in a period right now where, we really got to bring everybody up to this level, and until we all are fluent with this level, it's premature to try and go past that.
They both happen at the same time. Because it's something I think about all the time, because I try not to think about technical terms. We were talking about trying to get a common language, vertical sequencing, horizontal this. And I always get those two mixed up. I have dyslexia on those things. Right? Because which one is? Anyway, and I think that's fine. And that's why the creative for me leads the technical. In direct music, that box couldn't do everything I wanted. So I said, can we do something else? I do think it's a total danger, and I see that's whenever you need to educate, you have to come up with terms. You have to come up with examples that Michael's excellent book has codified. But I think as a student, you have to remember that there isn't a way that it's done, and that it's always evolving, right? And people say, how is adaptive music done? I'm like, are you kidding? That's for you to decide, hopefully.
I think there's a similar related issue, and then since we're wrapping up on the middleware thing, is that I think there's a danger of overselling middleware too in a big way, is that middleware is not the be-all, end-all, will solve all your problems. A whole lot of what goes into making a good audio, as people know, is the programming side of implementing it. Even right now with middleware, you can't simply say, oh, we're using WWISE, therefore all the programmer has to do is trigger events. There's still a lot of smarts, a lot of AI. I mean, look at what Overwatch is doing, even with WWISE, which they ripped apart their own custom version of WWISE to be able to do. And even then, they're not fully satisfied that there's this layer on top that has to be coded that doesn't exist and isn't solved by the current state of middleware. So middleware, again, it gets us up here, but it's a elevator, but it's also a ceiling, and you have to be really careful, I think, about overpromising.
So I want to reemphasize Brian's point, because I know, so in my classes at Berklee, a lot of students are learning about this, and game developers will hear this buzzword of like, oh, middleware, we have to use middleware, right? We got to put it into our game. And I know of at least 2 cases where in the end, it got funded in some weird way where they actually had to pull the middleware out because they didn't really know what it cost to actually. So that was in 2 student games that kind of went to final, and then all of a sudden they're going to be on the Xbox store, or they're going to be on PlayStation. They had to rip out the middleware to make it happen. So if you are pitching middleware to your game developer, make it very clear, not only the advantages, but and the time that it may save the team, but also make it very clear as to what it's going to cost when it goes to market and when they're charging for it, because it can get you into trouble.
Well, that was fantastic, guys. I really sat here enthralled the whole time. Thank you very, very much. I really appreciate it. I just want to close briefly on this, which is sort of a shameless plug, but also sort of what I think is the evolution of all of the things that you were talking about, where you can have music composition that is easy to understand and easy to implement by the composer. So a composer can get in and actually just drag and drop their adaptive music, and it also has, it doesn't stick you into one way of doing it. You can have different variations, and you can have different intensities, and then you can do segments and also MIDI and things like that. So it allows, I think it's sort of a tool that was written by composers for composers rather than maybe by programmers at DirectX or sound designers, which are some of the other tools that were developed. And there's a lot of cool things that you can do with it. I'm going to stop there and open it up.
So, this was really great. So kind of going off, the idea of mixing, right? There's this dichotomy where in post-production, you do sound design, you do music, and then there's this person who mixes it, which I think is really valuable to kind of separate that maybe from the designer or the composer. And without middleware, that's basically impossible in a game. And I kind of think, and I wonder, do you think it is impossible as well to have someone who comes in after the fact and mixes your game? It just seems like separating that from the design, because you have no idea, where 100 buses are. It seems impossible, and I'm wondering.
The answer is yes, it's impossible. No, I think the point is that the act of mixing a game is so unlike mixing a linear piece that there are things that the mixer could do if they were involved in the earlier stages of the game that they would not be able to do if all they do is come in after the fact. They may need to change the way things are routed. They need to create these new sub-buses that, frankly, at that stage in the game, no producer in their right mind would let you change so close to ship. So I think it's a process like all the other aspects of game audio. You can't just leave it to the end and say, oh, I'm going to have the expert, the mixer come in and they will, she will mix my music because she is the expert.
A lot of game companies do have these, hopefully, if they're luxurious, have a week or whatever, 2 weeks to mix at the end. And we were able to do that at Microsoft with Fable 2, I think it was. And what we did, Christopher Melroth kind of understood the sound design system. He was essentially the technical sound designer and director for the sound design. And we wanted extra outside ears, so we brought in Scott Gershon. And he sat with us for a couple days. And then Scott could say, well, could that be louder, a little bit more set back? And Melroth would go, yeah, okay, blah, 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 because he's on WWISE, it wasn't WWISE, but he was on the tool, just doing that in real time. How's that? Yeah, but now it's too much this. So we got fresh ears in there who really understands what a sonic landscape can be, and it also helped that he didn't know the game very well.
So now you need a technical sound mixer in addition to a technical sound designer.
Yeah, I think Brian's comment about the importance of having people on the teams as early as possible to understand the overall interactive structure is incredibly important. There was a really great talk at GDC on Destiny, the mixing of Destiny in team environment. So one of the interesting multiplayer things that happens, especially with a game like Destiny, is that if you go in with one player to test it and all of the other people are kind of shooting at you, it's a different dynamic when you put 6 players in that same environment and they're shooting at everybody else. And they talked about kind of doing a lot more testing where they actually bring in lots of players and they're constant in order to mix the game. And that may be, especially with team-based games, it's so important to kind of have that extra time spent on that. Right.
And this sort of also going back to Richard's point, one of the secret dark undersides of middleware too is their opacity. It's a great benefit that you create this black box content, you give to the programmer. They don't care whether it's, a single wave file plane or, 17 physical models through 12 DSP effects and 19 layers of waves. At the same time, these visual GUIs are really visual programming languages. And you can create these fairly complicated, very opaque, undocumented, difficult to understand systems. I teach at DigiPen, and I brought up this WISE project for that game that actually ended up getting canceled. I was talking about earlier that I used middleware, and I realized I don't remember what the interactive music system is, and I have to go through, and it's like, what the heck was I doing here? And I'm the one who made every single line of content in this thing, and it's the act of debugging these systems and the act of maintaining, right? If somebody had to come in after the fact and pick up this project a year from now, even if it's me picking it up a year from now, is incredibly difficult. Is that different than code? Code is generally, well-written code tends to be much more, at least somebody who's in a good programmer does a much better job of literally documenting in text what's going on. And I would find that code is easier for somebody to pick up and figure out what's going on than, again, an automatic flow charting thing or automatic, I would love to see middleware start to have these features, which are, again, they're not as sexy, but I think they would be amazingly useful. But then you got to be disciplined computer code has the same problem where, okay, what happens when the comments get out of sync with what the function really does? Now it's worse than having nothing because it has something that's wrong. But I think code lends itself a little bit more like that. And plus, in most software development practices, you have what's called code review. Code doesn't go into the build unless it's been reviewed by another human. And the human says, I don't understand what this function does. You need to comment that better. So I think some of these things, again, that's sort of the dark underbelly of middleware.
I just thought, when you mentioned the black box, and I feel like middleware has been actually a very good thing in this regard. And Dale, you mentioned teaching the developers WISE, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, but there's this phenomenon where we work on a project and an artist or someone or a programmer will think, this sound should be louder or this sound should be a little different. And then they'll go in and tweak it. And it blows my mind because I would never go and be like, I think this person's hat should be a different color, for an artist. And this seems to happen on so many projects. And it kind of blows my mind. And middleware has been this nice, we don't even a lot of our projects, tell anyone else how to install the authoring tool other than, so that we're the, and I feel like it's been this nice, we have, the control over that. And you mentioned teaching other people, and I'm wondering, have you guys encountered this as well, or what? That kind of just blows my mind.
Well, in cases that we're using Perforce or some other versioning control where they do have access to the FMOD or to the WISE projects, then yes, that has happened. A lot of times we'll just keep the builds on our side and not. But I think for the most part, if it does happen, it's pretty far and few between. So I think most programmers or producers that do have access to it we'll just use it to sort of do the playback and sort of hear the multiple variations. So, for example, if we have a voiceover plus a sound effect, and you want to have 5 different voiceovers and 5 different sound effects, they can play through them and hear what it's going to sound like in the game. And yeah, it's probably a good idea for us to tell them not to touch it.
Do you feel that audio is special in some way to have middleware that they can author all of their business in and is kind of a black box from the rest of the development team? Or do you feel like there are other disciplines in game development that have similar scenarios where they can author all of their content maybe outside the game with an auditioning pipeline? Is audio unique in this way to have middleware?
I think one of the reasons audio middleware popped up is because companies tend to spend a lot, at least on a big project, a lot of time on the art pipeline because, you've got 140 artists trying to push content to 20 programmers or 12 programmers or something like that. And I can't think of a big project that didn't have like dedicated art pipeline programmers, tools programmers to keep that iteration from Max, from Maya into the game. And they have a certain amount of real-time editing things and stuff like that. Technical artists. And
the example I can think of is I used to be a tools programmer, and I would design 3D, Direct 3D and OpenGL tool building. And so definitely for level designers and level builders, that's something that could be farmed out and you could use outside the dev team potentially in that way.
Part of it is audio just said, we need more. And somebody said, well, like whether it was Audio Kinetic or FMOD said, well, there's a need. People are asking for something. And it popped up because the companies themselves weren't giving us the features we wanted. Might be part of it. Now, one thing that PopCap, you and I, was that pretty soon after we got WWISE, there's this connective tissue you have to create. We didn't really talk about between your game engine and WWISE, and that's critical, and that's kind of one of the missing, or an area ripe for innovation anyway. But we got that pretty good, and after a while, and because we were running such a skeleton audio crew, artists were jealous, like, you guys can do that? You guys, what if we could do that with art? Because they were doing it the hard way, just with physical, more people, So I think some of the sophistication we were able to get with combination of Unity and WWISE in our case was really kind of interesting, just out of need.
Can the level designer just go into a GUI, put a torch on the wall that wasn't there before, and work like that? So, and maybe to a certain extent, just Unity and Unreal themselves are kind of like a big middleware. They're a game engine with a set number of pre-scripted features, and they're extensible in their own certain ways. So,
and then there are areas where the two come together. So with an animation engine, for example, we do for Warner Brothers DC Comic Legends. So there's the really cool animations, and they have to be timed because there's a fast forward button for people that don't want to wait around for the full animation if they want to do it fast. So we have to time it so that when the animation speeds up, the sounds hit at the same time that everything else hits. So then you've got an animation tool, which is a custom design inside of Unity that then we have to hook all the sounds up to. So there's places where sounds and art do come together. And I don't think there's any middleware that really allows you to do those syncs that well. Even video, right? I mean, if you want to do a sync to video using middleware sort of thing.
You see Unity and Unreal trying to give these tools, like the animation tool and blueprints and things like that, they're trying to give more GUI-based interfaces to developers so it's easier to make those games. And I think that in the future, we'll see a lot more of that and continuing to develop better interfaces for kind of building games. And so we'll see blueprints with more stuff in it, just like we saw Unreal add a bunch of new audio things on the audio side, and all these tools end up being sort of disruptors too, in terms of like, Elias has done this really incredible new thing that is not available in these other things, and FMOD's going to get their act together, and WWISE will get their act together, and then steal a few features, just like so. It's like I hope that continues in terms of one-upping one another, in terms of making our lives as composers or mixers or technical sound designers or whatever, level up, so to speak. And I think that's been helpful over the last couple of years to see that competition.
Unity and Unreal will always be one step behind the audio middleware in their audio.
Yeah. I think that there are just too many people working at WWISE and FMOD compared to the number of people at Unreal and Unity. It's nice that the floor is rising. And I know Aaron at Epic definitely has a vision of where he'd love to see. That said, Aaron is the audio programmer at Unreal. Also an awesome jazz trumpet player, which is why the Unreal audio. We were in a band there. The others back in 1987. Yeah, the question from Eric was whether or not we think there will be an open source audio middleware out there. That would be an interesting thing because then it could be customizable and people could take it. And I can say it costs, and again, I can speak from having had to go through the birthing of Exact, that creating these systems is definitely a lot of work. I mean, and it's a lot of effort, and maintaining it and making it into something that when Unreal updates and when Unity updates, that it turns out the version of the tool is broken and you got to update your tool and do it on Windows, Mac, Xbox, PlayStation, Android. It can be a very time-intensive thing. That said, I could certainly see somebody writing like a basic proto GUI that sits on top of OpenAL or something like that.
Some of us have been around long enough to see progress starting to be made on that front, and then complete, let's blow it up. And so this is a really IXM math. So there have been different attempts at this over the years, and I'm sort of convinced that small iterative things are a better way to go. I was talking to Damien a little bit earlier. Is there something tiny that we can do today that would and so one of the things that so at Berklee we teach a lot of these fundamental interactive techniques. And Duncan Watt, who's another composer in the Northeast, he also teaches at Berklee. He's like, well, why don't you just develop a file format naming convention for a layer track, right? There's no reason we can't do that on a very tiny scale where we get together and say, yeah, we're just going to file this so that Y says, oh, I get that. I understand that. Or even, it could be a meta tag, but even on a very simple, how can we iterate one little tiny thing to get us to that point where we are looking at more of a larger framework? I think it's tough because we've all tried and we've all been in support of it, but there's, it's kind of like, well, who's going to take that on? Well, it's like, who's, going to write and various people sort of fade in and fade out depending on how much availability there is. I think it's a really tough nut to crack.
I think, what is it called? Is it OpenAL, I guess, is part of it, or for the web audio API? Yeah, HTML5. Yeah. So the question was about web open source, and that may be a possibility for sure. But from my experience, about 3 to 4 years in seeing the development of Elias and helping with the development of Elias, guided by some of these guys and some of their theories and stuff that they've done, such as adding MIDI to something. That turns out to be a very complex problem. It requires a lot of technology, a lot of engineering, a lot of design. And I think to do that in an open source way would be pretty tough.
I've been, what about a hybrid approach? And this is just throwing something randomly into the air, but as I've been working with Reaper as my newest DAW, because I've been going through and revolving through different DAWs, that's punishing myself. They have an interesting model where the community really does add a lot of, it's open enough that people can crack it open and build stuff for it. So you can find components that you like, or a look that you like, or a layout that or a feature set. That's, if there was a slightly more open model and a more interesting.
One of the challenges is that the market is still pretty small if it's only game audio. So for your particular situation, I totally get what you want. You don't want to have being dependent upon this third-party license. It makes you more difficult to do stuff. That said, if you were to say, hey, here's the little feature set that we need done, let's build that ourselves or hire a contractor to do it so it's totally ownable in-house. And then you went to them and said, well, let's release this open source to the community. They might say, wait a minute, we just paid $100,000 for this guy to build it for us. Why should we release it to the community? I could see where that could be a problem.
I have a tiny thing to add to that, only knowing a little bit about the Unity audio system. And the Unity audio system is actually based on a subset of the FMOD library. It's so you can actually drag, ironically, an XM mod file into it and it will play, right, straight out of the box. So, and that's part of the old FMOD code that's in there. But I think, and having just released this thing, I actually don't know if Unity has any audio people at Unity anymore.
They do. They're in Bellevue.
Well,
Bellevue in Denmark, yeah.
It's interesting trying to get any kind of support at all. And I've talked to, lots and lots of people about that. And it's almost like they wrote a bunch of stuff and then I can't ask them about it. And I've had like 3 or 4 different Unity reps try and get questions answered, and it's always dead silence. And so maybe people in Seattle, because you guys are.
You got to take. That's right. You got to take Mike out to coffee.
Okay. All right.
He'll answer all your questions.
Okay. All right. So, anyways, thank you.
So that's a great point of support, and that definitely, is another thing that you have to have a pretty robust community, I think, in the open source in order to do that. So I put together some slides thinking that we might get to this about what middleware costs, and this is an evolving thing. This was captured a few weeks ago, so I don't know if it's the same. Max, maybe this is just page 1, so it does get a little bit more complex. But what's great is that WWISE is trying to reach out to the lower end free customers and stuff like that. So there are those options, of course, and then it can go up to quite a bit more expensive if you have a bigger budget. Here's the second page, sort of the core license costs. Basically, 3 different tiers, I guess: low, medium, and high. FMOD has a simpler system, slightly simpler. Basically, if your budget's under $500K, which is a much higher ceiling, it's free. You get 1 game per year. And then if it's over $500K, $5,000. That's for any number of platforms. It used to be per platform. So there's a bit of a price war going on, I think. And then premium games, it's over $1.5 million. Fabric has this. Actually, they lowered their prices as well. Free 1 game per year, sort of following after FMOD. Some medium licenses, if you're under, it looks like between 500, so they raised the ceiling as well. And then larger license over 1 million. Elias is basically custom. You just call them and they'll work something out, because there really isn't one price fits all. There's AAA, there's AAA mobile, there's mid-core mobile, different, what's your audio budget? And then you basically, okay, what are you willing to pay? We know what we'd like to get. And then there's also royalty models and things like that. So it's a very fluid and interesting time in middleware.
The price of these things have come down. The original WWISE pricing model was $80K for 1 platform. And so I believe support was extra. That's within the last 4 years, because I think it was GameSoundCon LA at the convention center, which was 3 years ago. They gave away a free FMOD license to an indie developer. And they were just announcing, below this much, it's now free for indies. So that was pretty huge. The other middleware manufacturers followed suit really, really fast. And it makes sense in a sense. It's sort of like the, hey, when you're right out of school and you're starting, we want you to learn our tools, which is why Unity and Unreal are the same way now. Unreal used to, the barrier to get in for Unreal Engine was $1 million. And if you didn't have $1 million check to write, Mark Rain didn't want to talk to you. Now it's free.
First quick thing about the pricing page, because you brought it up. It's a sliding scale. Also, it's more like guidelines than anything. So, I didn't know that before I went there, but then I learned that that's what goes on. So, and I'm just like, so do you want Do you want it? Yeah, okay, we'll make it work. Then we make it work, and depending on the dev, maybe sometimes they don't want it to work no matter what. The sound designer wants it to work, or the composer wants it to work, but the dev's just like, ah. But yeah, so that was the only thing I have to say. But for the other thing, it made me think about a project we did in school. So we hooked up OSC out of Unreal UDK to Pure Data and into Reaper. So we basically had Reaper have like all our audio content, and we were switching tracks, switching parameters into Reaper in real time, and using Pure Data as like a randomization within parameters of like, okay, so we want this level to be in certain scales. We want it to evolve like that, and we were only taking OSC out of UDK. So I can't imagine today not being able to do something with Pure Data along those lines. And I heard it packages super well. And with the guys from Heavy doing stuff, I can't also imagine them not being able to like give you access to maybe an experimental branch that they're doing to export to other interactive applications. So I mean, I'd definitely look into that. And maybe get in touch with the guys at Native. Who knows? Maybe Reactor has like a super other runtime version for interactive applications.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you all very much. Thanks again to the panel. Appreciate it. And have fun. Have a great conference.